So the markets have obviously been absolutely rocked by the war in Ukraine. Back when Russia invaded, we saw commodity prices explode. We saw markets tank across the board. We saw inflation spike in about 50 different countries, and currencies even fluctuated wildly as well, and no one knew exactly what was going to happen. Investors, just plain and simple, didn't know how to price their assets anymore, and so we saw wild 10% drops in stocks and even indexes, followed by equally wild 10% rises in those same indexes. Of course, though, the trend was decidedly downwards, hence the bear market of 2022 being very real. Now, many people thought that this would only really be an issue for a little while, that the war would end rather quickly, and that these sanctions on Russia would help to end the war as well, and that before long the markets would go back to normal, commodity prices would return to normal, and this energy price crunch would end as well. The people who thought that, though, were wildly wrong, and the war is raging on faster and more aggressively than ever before. Just yesterday, we saw a massive change in the dynamic of the war that threatens to massively increase the scope of the conflict, maybe drag new participants into the conflict, and of course, violently shake our markets as well. We are, of course, talking about the missile that landed in Poland, killing 2 people in a NATO country, and today we will establish everything that we know, what various world leaders have said, what we might expect to happen next, and what exactly this means for the markets. So just yesterday, the G20 meeting convened, which basically consists of the 20 most important and richest and most powerful countries in the world. Notably, though, it lacks Russia in the wake of this invasion of Ukraine. Now, there are many NATO members in the G20. There's the US, the UK, France and Germany and Italy. There's the EU as a whole and a bunch of other Western allies too. But there are also a bunch of countries that aren't necessarily aligned with the West, like Brazil, South Africa, China, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Now, this conglomerate of powerful nations at the G20 advanced a resolution to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, though some states weren't exactly too happy about this. Russia, for sure, though, was extremely unhappy about this, and they wanted it to be very well known, so they launched loads of missile strikes into Ukraine a couple of days ago for this very reason. Now, we are not 100% sure how many missiles were actually fired at Ukraine. Ukraine claimed that about 90 were fired, and that seems to be about the right number. Most media outlets are reporting about 100, and Russia is also accepting that these missiles were fired as well. They are not trying to deny this at all, so we do know that this is true. We also know that Ukraine has been trying to shoot down these missiles for obvious reasons. They often kill civilians, they often kill military personnel, and they often target valuable infrastructure as well. So every missile that can be shot down is a small win for Ukraine. Well, on top of that, we've also got some new footage of this Ukrainian air defenses actually shooting down some of these Russian missiles, and I'll be showing you this footage behind me right now as we speak. On the whole, Ukraine claimed that 77 of the 90 missiles that were fired were shot down. We don't know how accurate that number is, and to be honest, it seems a little bit too optimistic coming from Ukraine in my opinion. But the important thing here isn't how many of these missiles were shot down, it's the fact that Russia has fired missiles at Ukraine, including at western cities in Ukraine like Lviv, and Ukraine has shot some of them down. Now, this, though, is where the problems really start to emerge, as yesterday we got some early reports stating that a missile had landed in Poland and it had killed 2 people. As the hours went by, this ended up being confirmed to the point where we now know for 100% for certainty that yes, a missile landed in Poland and it killed 2 civilians about 5 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. Now, this is incredibly important because Poland is a NATO member, a NATO country, and an ally of every other NATO country. Now, NATO is, of course, a collective defense agreement, and this could be deemed an attack on Poland, and so could cause the whole of NATO to be obligated to go to the aid of Poland. Now, I do need to quickly clarify how NATO actually works here because many people don't understand it at all. But even if a country in NATO is attacked by a country outside of NATO, that doesn't mean that that country has to invoke NATO's Article 5 Collective Defense Clause. And even if they do, it also doesn't dictate the level of support each country has to provide. The best example of this here is Britain being invaded by Argentina in 1982. That was clearly an attack on the United Kingdom, but the UK didn't invoke NATO's Article 5 at all, and so NATO didn't get involved in the war. Another good example of this was that the US did in fact invoke Article 5 in the wake of 9/11, calling it an attack on the United States, and every NATO country did respond and aid the US, at least to some extent, but the degree or the amount of support given varied massively by country. with some countries doing absolutely loads and as much as they could to help the United States, like the United Kingdom, and some countries doing barely anything at all. So if you see someone say that an attack on a NATO country instantly means World War III, please understand that that isn't at all how it works. Now, at this point in the story, we know that a missile lands in Poland and kills 2 people, but we don't know all the facts like whose missile it was, where it was fired from, and if it was an accident or on purpose. So politicians did what politicians do, and they came out and made a bunch of different statements. The Biden administration, which is obviously the most important thing to hear from, came out and said that any deliberate attack on any NATO country is an attack on every NATO country and it will be met with full force. They also said that every inch of NATO soil will be defended in its entirety and there will be no cop-out at all. We got some statements from countries like Latvia condemning the war and calling for a response from the West, and we also got lots of press speculating over what happened exactly, what the response will be, and everything you would expect. At this point though, it was still very early hours and there was no immediate response from any NATO country, which has led to many people pointing out the weakness behind Western politicians. Now you probably walk around with a wallet that looks a bit like this. Old, thick, heavy and made of leather. Frankly, there had to be a better way to store cards and cash, and actually it turns out there is, thanks to Ridge Wallet. It's sleek and robust, and yet it can still hold everything that I need at just a fraction of the size of my old wallet, and yet I've still got all my cards and cash in it. They've even now got a key holder as well to tidy and sleeken that up too, so get the best offer available by clicking the link down below in the description and going to ridge.com/stoic. Now back to the video, and we are finally at the point where we talk about what various nations are claiming. Now right off the bat, the United States came out almost as quickly as possible and tried to tell everyone that this had nothing to do with Russia at all, that it wasn't a Russian missile, that it didn't come from Russia, and even if it did, it certainly wasn't on purpose and was just an accident, so there's nothing here to worry about at all. Now, many people are incredibly skeptical of this claim for obvious reasons. The Biden administration has lied constantly, and if this is true, it conveniently means that Biden doesn't have to make any hard decisions, which he really isn't mentally capable of making at all. Now, Ukraine came out and said that it was a Russian missile, that it overshot Ukraine and just landed in Poland. The Russians came out and said that that wasn't true at all, which is exactly what you would expect. And it wasn't entirely clear who to believe, but there are a few different possibilities of what could have happened that I just want to establish here. Now, the first possibility is that this was a Russian missile that was intentionally fired into Poland to test what NATO would do. And if this is the case, then NATO has utterly failed with no response at all. But I do think this is quite unlikely to actually be the case. The second option is that this was a Russian missile that was either just off course and accidentally landed in Poland. As I said, it was only a few kilometers into Poland. Or there's the possibility that it was knocked off course by Ukrainian anti-missile defense, so it landed in Poland on accident in that way, and this is most likely to be the truth if you ask me. The other option is that it was a Ukrainian missile sent to try and destroy a Russian missile which just landed in Poland by accident after missing its target, and this is what Biden is implying happened, though he of course won't come out right and say it. I have to say, though, that the evidence actually speaks against this reality being the case, which is what the US is claiming. The impact crater of this missile, which you can see from photos very easily online, was very large, much bigger than you would be expecting to see from an S-300 anti-air missile, which the US is saying was the culprit, so that doesn't line up in my opinion. Finally, there is the chance that this was a false flag attack orchestrated by the US and allies, fired into Poland on purpose by Ukraine or the West to try and drag NATO into this war. This is incredibly unlikely in my opinion because of the response we've seen from the West. They aren't blaming Russia at all, so it really just wouldn't make any sense for it to be a false flag to blame Russia if they then come out and defend Russia with everything they've got. Now, what most people aren't talking about regarding all of this, but what actually really does need to be talked about, is what this means for Eastern and Western relations in general and the war as a whole. Now, we are seeing tensions between East and West get worse every single week, not better. States on the border with Russia, in particular, are insanely happy with the state of geopolitics, and they're on edge for obvious reasons. Russia's war in Ukraine is also not stopping or slowing down at all, and Russia is outright refusing to withdraw from the country and end this war. Ukraine are making progress, they are liberating land and pushing Russians back, but it's very slow and Russia doesn't want to give up what it's taken, so the most likely outcome is that this war continues for years into the future at this point. This event with this missile landing in Poland, whether it came from Ukraine or Russia or some other random third party, speaks to this fact that tensions are getting worse, that the markets will stay on edge throughout the entirety of this war, and so they will not recover. What this really means is that the energy crisis and the crunch in Europe is going to continue for years as well, because the war will continue. Natural gas prices will stay unreasonably high for years into the future, and these sanctions against Russia will remain in place as well. On top of all that, the supply of commodities in general will remain strained in the West for years, and this is very bad news for all of our investments. The old term that war is good for business is only true for companies whose business is war, like Lockheed Martin. For the vast majority of companies, that you likely have your money invested in, like Apple or Google or any normal company, they want peace so they can reach as many customers as possible. And the trouble between East and West is making their business prospects much worse, not better. These companies also absolutely dominate the stock market, and they likely dominate your investments as well. This missile strike will not be the only one to land in Poland by my bets. The war's been going on for not even an entire year, and it's likely to continue for years into the future. So more will follow, and the markets will suffer every time. This is the simple thing that almost no one is talking about regarding this war, but it's actually so important for people to understand this, because we all have investments, and these investments are directly being impacted by what happens in Ukraine every single day. Now, the other really big problem with all of this is the West and NATO have been saying over and over for months on end that if anything, any part of this war gets even remotely close to NATO land, a full response will come out. This is supposed to be a deterrent. We know that Russia is aggressive. They started this war in Ukraine that's already killed over 100,000 people. And we know they like to see just how far they can push. And so NATO needs to ensure that Russia can't act with impunity. And this whole ordeal just screams weakness from the West. Before anyone had any concrete ideas of what had actually happened, US officials came out and said that it clearly wasn't Russia, and that even if it was Russia, it was almost certainly an accident, and that there were no ill will here. To be clear here, I do think that's most likely the truth, that this was an accident, but even if there is a slight inclination that Russia was testing boundaries with NATO, then they got exactly what they wanted. This missile blew up in NATO territory, it killed 2 people, and NATO did absolutely nothing about it. What happens if a second missile lands in NATO? What if it kills 10 people? What if 2 or 3 or many missiles land next time? All this does is reassure Russia that actually they can escalate this war, and NATO and Western politicians in particular are too afraid and too weak to actually do anything about it. And that again is bad for your investments, because it means Russia is motivated to escalate this war. This is especially important after Russia has been threatening to use nukes in Ukraine for many months on end now, and they have yet another reason to believe that if they do go this far, that NATO will just stand and watch by and do nothing about it, and this will damage your investments. It's also worth noting here that trusting the US administration and Biden is a very dangerous thing to do. There are loads of allegations of money laundering surrounding Ukraine that have just blown up in the wake of this FTX crypto collapse, and it seems relatively likely that actually there's some truth behind them. Over the last year, this administration has lied and lied and lied, and they've proven themselves to be untrustworthy, and claim that this wasn't a Russian missile just gets Biden off the hook of having to make a difficult decision that he doesn't want to make. Many people may call me skeptical regarding this, but my skepticism is rooted in truth and based off of the previous behavior of the Biden administration over the last year, so I do think it's fully justifiable. Now, finally, I just want to say that it's obviously very difficult to talk about these sort of things on places like YouTube. Censorship, cancelling, and just being banned happens constantly, so you really do have to tread lightly. If you'd like to hear exactly what I think about these things that I can't really talk about, what's really going on, what my actual views are with no filter whatsoever, then go and have a look at the link for Stoic Financial Freedom in the description, where I can speak 100% freely with no risk of being deleted or cancelled at all. With Stoic Financial Freedom, you also get loads of benefits like hours upon hours of exclusive content not available anywhere else, special privileges in our Discord server, and a direct message line to me to ask any questions you really want answered. We're running a November only 60% off pre-sale that will end in 2 weeks, and we're only selling 1 single slot every single day, so you really do need to be quick if you want to join. I look forward to seeing you there, and until next time, stay stoic.